He had kept the secret for 32 years. He was 4 years old when his father came home late on an October night in 1989, and he did not understand what he saw. He was 11 when something his father said at a kitchen table made him feel a coldness he could not name. He was 19 when he found, in a box in a closet his father told him never to open, a woman's bracelet and a folded newspaper clipping about a missing waitress from the town of Espola, New Mexico. He was 36 years old, sitting in a parked car outside a grocery store in Albuquerque, when he finally picked up his phone and dialed the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to someone about an old case. His hands were shaking. He had been rehearsing the call for 17 years. When the line connected and a detective answered, he said, "My name is Curtis Rowell. I think my father killed a woman, and I think I've known it most of my life." But before we get to what Curtis knew and what it cost him to say it, we have to go back to the beginning, to the woman who deserved to be found long before any of this, and to the town where she made her life. Because to understand the full weight of what Curtis carried, you first have to understand who Pauline Archuleta was. Espaola sits in the high desert of northern New Mexico, in the shadow of the Jemez Mountains, at an elevation of nearly 6,000 feet. The light there is the particular gold of the Southwest, the kind that makes everything look like it's being held at a slight angle to the sun, warm and clarifying, and a little indifferent. In 1989, it was a small city of about 8,000 people, predominantly Hispanic, with deep roots in the colonial land grants that predated New Mexico's statehood by centuries. It had a Dairy Queen, a couple of gas stations, a busy state road that connected it to Santa Fe to the south and Taos to the north, and a diner on Paseo de Ote called the Rio Grill, where the green chili cheeseburgers were, by community consensus, the best in the valley. Pauline Archuleta worked the closing shift at the Rio Grill 5 nights a week. She was 34 years old, a New Mexico native whose family had been in the valley for 5 generations, and she was the kind of woman the restaurant industry keeps and the rest of the world underestimates. She could carry 4 plates and remember 6 orders and refill your coffee without being asked, and still find time to ask how your mother was doing. And she did all of it with the particular efficiency of someone who had been working hard since she was old enough to. She had started at the Rio Grill at 22 and worked her way to shift supervisor in 3 years. She had a daughter, Marisol, who was 13 in the fall of 1989, and a mother named Lucia, who lived 2 streets over and watched Marisol after school. Pauline's own marriage had ended quietly in 1984. No drama, no lawyers, just 2 people who had found they were better as friends than as spouses and had arranged their lives accordingly. Her ex-husband, Jorge, remained close. He helped with Marisol. He showed up to her school plays. Pauline kept a garden of chiles and tomatoes in clay pots on the apartment steps. She had a dog named Tornado, a border collie mix with one blue eye, who accompanied her on Saturday morning walks through the bosque along the river. She collected turquoise, rings, pendants, a thin bracelet she wore on her left wrist that her grandmother had given her and that she had not taken off in 6 years. On the evening of October 17, 1989, Pauline worked her shift at the Rio Grill and closed the kitchen at 10 p.m. Her co-worker, a young man named Eddie Trujillo, offered her a ride home. She told him she was fine, that it was a short walk, and that the night was too pretty to miss. He watched her go out the front door. The air was cool and dry, and the sky over the mountains was full of stars. He went back inside to finish mopping. Pauline Archuleta did not arrive home that night. Her daughter woke at 2 a.m. and found her grandmother asleep in the chair and her mother's bed empty, and went and stood in the doorway of the dark kitchen and understood, in the way that children understand things before they have words for them, that something was wrong. She was never seen again. The search began before dawn on October 18th. Jorge Archuleta, reached by phone at 3 a.m. by Lucia, drove from his apartment across town and was at the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office by 4:30. The route Pauline would have walked home, 6 blocks, well lit for the first 4, and then 2 darker ones along a lot where a construction project had taken out the street lamps, was walked by deputies before sunrise. Nothing was found on the route. No purse, no keys, no sign of a struggle. A neighbor 2 blocks from the Rio Grill reported hearing a car idling near the construction lot sometime around 10:30 that night. She had not looked out. She could not describe the vehicle. The investigation was led by Detective Ramona Salazar, a 7-year veteran of the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office, who was 31 years old and who took the case, by her own later account, because she was the only detective in the office who did not have something else pending that week. She would work it for the next 11 years. In the first month, investigators built a picture of Pauline's life that revealed no obvious threats. She had no known enemies, no creditors, no disputes. The 2 men closest to her, Jorge and Eddie Trujillo, were interviewed multiple times and cleared. A man who had been making unwanted advances toward Pauline at the restaurant was identified and questioned. He had been in Santa Fe that night for a cousin's quinceañera, confirmed by 40 witnesses and a photograph. What Salazar had was a construction lot, a missing woman, a car no one had seen, and a community that had put up flyers and held a vigil and refused to believe that this was a case that would go unsolved. By early 1990, without a body, without forensic evidence, without a suspect, the investigation had exhausted its initial momentum. The case remained open. Salazar kept it open. She requested additional resources twice that year and was told twice that the office could not spare them. Pauline's turquoise bracelet, the one her grandmother had given her, the one she had never taken off, was never found. Until a man named Curtis Rowell found it in a box in a closet in 2006. The years did what years do to people left waiting. By 1993, 4 years after Pauline disappeared, Marisol was 17 and had learned to talk about her mother in the past tense, which she hated and did anyway, because the alternative was worse. She kept a photograph on her nightstand, Pauline at the Rio Grill, apron on, mid-laugh, caught between tables by whoever had the camera. Marisol looked at it every night before she turned off the light. She still does. By 1997, 8 years in, Tornado the border collie had died of old age, and Lucia had planted a rosebush in the yard in Pauline's memory and tended it with the same attention she had given everything she loved. Detective Salazar had been promoted to sergeant by then, which meant fewer hours on cold cases, but she kept Pauline's file in her own desk instead of the archive. When people asked her about it, she told them the case was still active. She said this long past the point where it was strictly true. Because the alternative, telling Marisol and Jorge and Lucia that nobody was looking anymore, was something she could not bring herself to do. By 2001, Lucia passed away without knowing what had happened to her daughter. The rosebush kept growing. By 2005, 16 years gone, Marisol had a son of her own. She named him after her grandfather. She had finished a nursing degree in Albuquerque and moved back to Espaula to be close to what remained of the family. She drove past the Rio Grill every day on the way to work. She had never eaten there again. The reward poster, $1,000 initially, raised by Rio Grill staff and regulars, had been renewed twice by the restaurant owner, a man named Gilbert Montoya, who had kept Pauline's photograph above the register since 1989. In 2005, he raised it to $3,000. Nobody called. Then, in 2006, a 36-year-old man named Curtis Rowell drove to his parents' house in Espaola to help his father clear out a storage room and found a shoebox on the top shelf of a closet that his father told him, sharply, to leave alone. Curtis had heard that tone before. He left the room. 3 days later, when his father was out, he went back. Inside the shoebox, a length of paracord, a folded newspaper clipping from the October 1989 edition of the Rio Grande Sun with a headline about a missing waitress, and a thin turquoise bracelet. Curtis Rowell sat on the floor of that closet for 40 minutes. Then he put everything back the way he found it and drove home and did not sleep that night or the night after that. Every case on this channel comes from weeks of research, verified against court records and documented interviews, out of respect for the people whose stories we tell. If this work matters to you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Pauline. Curtis Rowell had grown up with a father he described, in his 2021 interview with the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office, as two different men. There was the man who showed up to Curtis's Little League games and grilled carne asada on Sundays, and taught him to change a tire in a Walmart parking lot when he was 15. And there was the other one, the one who appeared without warning, cold and unreachable, who had a temper that arrived without preamble and left without apology, and that Curtis had learned, early, to navigate around the way you navigate around something fixed and dangerous in a river. His father, Dwayne Rowell, had worked as a long-haul truck driver in 1989, running routes between Albuquerque and Denver that kept him away from home 3 or 4 nights a week. He had lived in Espaola at the time. He had lived 6 blocks from the Rio Grill. Curtis had been 4 years old on the night of October 17, 1989. What he remembered was this. His father came home late. His mother was already asleep. His father washed his hands at the kitchen sink for a long time. He stood at the sink in the dark and washed his hands, and Curtis watched from the hallway, and his father did not see him. He had never told anyone about that memory. He had held it for 32 years, like a stone he could not put down or throw away, not fully understanding it when he was a child, not wanting to understand it as he grew older, not able to stop understanding it by the time he was an adult. After finding the bracelet in 2006, he spent 15 more years in the particular paralysis that comes from knowing something you cannot unknow and cannot yet bring yourself to act on. He told his wife in 2012. She sat with him while he cried. She said, "You have to call." He said, "I know." He did not call for 9 more years. What broke it open, finally, was Marisol. He had never met her. But in 2021, a local news station ran a piece on cold cases from northern New Mexico, a 30th anniversary segment on unsolved disappearances, and they showed a photograph of Pauline, and then they showed Marisol, who was now 45, and she said on camera, "I just want to know where she is. That's all I've ever wanted. Just tell me where she is." Curtis watched it on his phone in the parking lot of a grocery store. He sat in the car for a long time. Then he called the number. The detective who took his call was a young investigator named Sergeant Anthony Delgado, 29 years old, who had joined the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office 2 years earlier, and who had been assigned a rotation through cold cases as part of his training. He listened to Curtis for 40 minutes without interrupting. When Curtis finished, Delgado said, "Can you bring me the bracelet?" Curtis said, "I've had it in my car for 3 weeks." The bracelet was entered into evidence in September 2021. It was tested immediately for Dina. A full female Dina profile was recovered from the clasp and inner band, consistent with someone who had worn it daily, long-term. That profile was run against Pauline Archuleta's Dina reference sample, obtained in 1989 from a hairbrush recovered from her apartment. The match was confirmed within 4 days. The bracelet had belonged to Pauline. A search of Rio Arriba County land records and historical mapping identified a parcel of undeveloped high desert land outside of Iquique that had been used in 1989 as an informal dump site for construction debris. The parcel had been adjacent to the route Duane Raoul drove regularly on his northbound runs. In December 2021, investigators with cadaver dogs searched the area. They found Pauline Archuleta 30, 2 years after she disappeared, on a Tuesday morning, beneath 3 feet of compacted clay soil and desert stone, in ground that had been walked over by hikers and campers and hunters for 3 decades without anyone knowing what it held. She was brought home to Espaola in January 2022. Duane Rowell, now 68 and living in retirement in Rio Rancho, was arrested on February 3, 2022. He came to the door in a flannel shirt, his hair white, his face revealing nothing. Sergeant Delgado later said that what struck him was how unsurprised Raoul looked. Not resigned, exactly, but settled. The way someone looks when they have been carrying a weight for so long that its removal is almost indistinguishable from exhaustion. At his arrest, he said nothing. In his first interview, he asked for an attorney. The attorney, assigned by the state, advised him to remain silent. The physical evidence did not need his cooperation. Forensic analysis of the paracord found in the shoebox matched the fiber composition and coloring of a type sold exclusively at a hardware chain Raoul was documented to have frequented. Dina recovered from beneath the bracelet's clasp. Trace cellular material from the person who had removed it matched Duane Raoul. He entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder in November 2022, 11 months after his son made the call. At sentencing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. He shook his head. Curtis Raoul was not in the courtroom. He had given his testimony and left the state. He and his wife moved to Oregon in the spring of 2022. He has not spoken publicly about his father since the sentencing. In his final interview with investigators, he said, "I should have called in 2006. I know that. I'll have to live with that." Sergeant Delgado told him, "You called. That's what mattered." At sentencing, Marisol Archuleta stood and read from a piece of paper she had written out by hand. It was 2 pages. She talked about her mother's garden, her mother's laugh, the dog named Tornado, the turquoise bracelet her great-grandmother had given Pauline that Pauline had never taken off. She talked about waking up at 2 in the morning at 13 years old and understanding something she didn't have words for. She talked about 32 years of an empty chair at every table. At the end, she looked at the bench and not at Duane Raoul. She said, "My mother was found." That is enough to breathe again. It's not enough, but it's enough to breathe. Pauline Archuleta is buried in the Camposanto on the edge of Espaola, where her family has been buried for generations, in the same ground her grandmother and her mother rest in, under a headstone that gives her name and her years, and in smaller letters beneath, the words her daughter chose, "She was home here." The rosebush Lucia planted in 1997 still grows. Marisol tends it. The Rio Grill closed in 2018, when Gilbert Montoya retired. Before he locked it for the last time, he took the photograph of Pauline down from above the register and brought it to Marisol. She keeps it in her living room now, beside a school photo of her son and a small piece of turquoise she bought for herself. Not a replacement for what was taken, just something to carry forward. There is a particular cruelty in what Duane Raul managed to do. He did not just take Pauline. He made her son complicit, without Curtis's knowledge or consent, in the keeping of a secret that hollowed out 32 years of his life. A child who saw his father washing his hands in the dark. A teenager who learned to be afraid of a tone of voice. An adult who spent 15 years knowing what he knew and not knowing how to carry it from knowing to doing. Curtis Raul did not choose to be in that story. He was put there. And when he finally found a way out of it, it cost him his father, his hometown, and the life he had built around both. There is something worth sitting with in the idea of a man who hid a bracelet for 32 years, not destroyed it, not thrown it away, but kept it. Why do that? Maybe there is no answer that makes sense, which is sometimes the truest thing that can be said about the minds of people who do terrible things. But it was the keeping of it that ended him. The bracelet survived. The truth survived inside it, and a daughter who had waited since she was 13 years old finally got to bring her mother home. What does it say about the burden we place on the people closest to someone who commits a crime, that Curtis Raul carried this for 32 years, and that the system had no mechanism to reach him, no way of knowing he existed, until he reached out himself? And when you consider the role that a single, ordinary object played, a bracelet kept in a shoebox on a shelf, what does it tell you about why evidence preservation from cold cases matters so much, even after decades? And how do you begin to measure the cost of what Curtis gave up when he made that call? Justice found Pauline Archuleta after 32 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved stories are waiting in the description below. Thank you for watching.